Robert Morales had spent his entire life working hard, building a home, and raising his son with all the love he had. But as old age crept in, his life took a turn he had never imagined. Living with his son and daughter-in-law, he gradually felt like a fading shadow, a burden no one wanted to bear. Then one day, Alexander, his son, told him to pack his bags. "We're going on a trip," he said. But that trip was nothing like Robert thought it would be. When the car stopped, he stepped out and was speechless at the sight before him. What left him unable to speak? Keep following, the next development will surprise you. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailor-made for you. The story begins. The old man steps out of the car and the shocking scene: an old man, thinking his son was taking him to a nursing home, stepped out of the car and was utterly stunned by what he saw. A heartwarming twist that will leave you speechless. Comment where you're listening from, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe for more. Robert Morales, a 72-year-old widower, sat quietly in his small room in Austin, Texas, gazing out the window at the bustling streets below. He had always been a proud man, proud of being a man who valued his independence. But now his body was failing him, his memory was fading, and his heart was heavy. Living with his son Alexander and daughter-in-law Marianne, Robert felt like a ghost of the man he once was. Robert had a plan. He decided he didn't want to be a burden anymore. Guilt gnawed at him every time he saw his grandson's room that he was now occupying. The hurried goodbyes from the family before they left for work, and the meals delivered by Teresa, their neighbor. The thought of moving to a nursing home seemed less like an exile and more like a relief for everyone. But beneath his stoic exterior, Robert yearned for something he couldn't quite name. He didn't just feel forgotten, he felt unnecessary. Robert's life hadn't always been like this. His mind often wandered back to San Antonio, where he and his late wife Sophie had built their life together in their small wooden house. Sophie had brought warmth to his world, her laughter echoing in every corner of their home. Robert had adopted Alexander when he married Sophia. The boy wasn't his biological son, but from the moment Alexander called him Dad, Robert vowed to give him everything. Together, they had turned a Skromny house into a oasis filled with love, hard work, and simple joys. Robert was a man of the land, tending to his garden with the help of Palomo, his loyal horse. But it all changed on the night of the fire. One evening, Robert lit a candle to ward off the darkness when a power outage left his house without lights. Exhausted after a day of harvesting potatoes with Palomo, he fell asleep on the divan. By the time he woke up, the air was thick with smoke. Neighbors broke down the door and pulled him out to safety. But the house, his memories, Sophie's belongings, and their life together were reduced to ashes. When Robert woke up in the hospital after 24 days, the doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. But he didn't feel lucky. He felt empty. When Alexander brought him to Austin to recover, Robert left behind not just his house but a part of his soul. Life in Alexander's house wasn't what Robert had hoped for. Alexander and Marianne were busy with work and seemed distant, leaving Teresa, the neighbor, to take care of his meals and needs. Though kind, Teresa wasn't shy about voicing her opinions. "They don't want you here," she said one day, shaking her head. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children don't want to deal with us." Her words haunted him. On his birthday, Robert sat alone with a slice of cake that Teresa had left for him. Alexander and Marianne had wished him a happy birthday in the morning, but didn't stay to celebrate. The loneliness was suffocating. Robert couldn't bear it any longer. One evening, he cornered Alexander. "Take me to a nursing home," he said resolutely. "Sell my land in San Antonio. Use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Marianne anymore, Dad." "Not now," Alexander replied with a sigh. "We'll talk about this later. I've had a long day." Robert's frustration boiled over. "If you won't do it, I will. I'll find a nursing home myself." Alexander simply patted him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Robert feeling more invisible than ever. The days turned into weeks, and the promise of taking Robert to a nursing home seemed to vanish into thin air. Every night, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the worn-out photo of Sophie that he kept in his wallet, whispering apologies to her for the burden he had become. His heart grew heavier with each passing day. The silence in Alexander's and Marianne's house amplified his loneliness. Then, one bright Saturday morning, everything changed. Alexander walked into Robert's room, carrying a crisp white shirt, a neatly folded pair of trousers, and a new toiletry bag. Marianne followed behind with a towel and new bed sheets in her hands. "Pack your things, Dad," Alexander said. His voice was steady but unreadable. "We're going on a trip." Robert was stunned into silence. His hands trembled as he clutched the photo. The words echoed in his ears, filling him with a mix of relief tinged with bitterness and sorrow. They were finally taking him away. He nodded silently, not daring to look Alexander in the eye, afraid that he might see pity, or worse, guilt. He packed his belongings quickly, carefully folding his few clothes. His heart ached as he placed Sophie's photo on top of the pile, zipping up the suitcase with a finality as if it were a last goodbye. The car ride started in silence. The hum of the engine was the only sound. Robert sat in the back seat, clutching his suitcase tightly, his knuckles white. Alexander drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Marianne looked out. The window, a faint smile playing on her lips. To Robert, her smile seemed out of place, a sign of joy on a day that he believed was a somber one. As they left the city limits of Austin, the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets gave way to rolling hills and vast fields. The scenery seemed to blur into one, but to Robert, every detail stood out vividly. The weathered fences lining the roads, the clusters of wildflowers scattered across the fields, the ancient oak trees that occasionally stood majestically against the sky. These sights reminded him of his younger days, of trips with Sophie through the countryside, their laughter filling the air as they imagined growing old together. Robert's thoughts drifted further into the past. He remembered Sophia's laughter, the way it bubbled up when he told one of his corny jokes. He remembered Alexander's first steps, the way he wobbled and fell into his arms, his giggles echoing through the house. And he remembered his garden in San Antonio, the smell of damp, rich soil as he and Buddy worked side by side to nurture their crops. He let out a shaky sigh, his eyes welling up. He wasn't just leaving his family behind. He was leaving behind a lifetime of memories, a home that no longer existed, and the dreams that he and Sophie had once shared. Alexander glanced at Robert in the rearview mirror, noticing the old man wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with concern. Robert quickly tucked the handkerchief back into his pocket and managed a nod. "Yeah, just a little tired." Marianne turned in her seat and gave him a gentle smile. "We're almost there, you'll feel better soon." Robert nodded again, his throat tightening. "Almost there." The words echoed in his ears. Was it a promise of relief or a confirmation of his greatest fear? As the car climbed a winding road lined with thick trees, Robert realized he no longer recognized the area. His heart began to pound faster. There were no houses, no signs of civilization, just occasional gaps in the trees where sunlight pierced through. The road seemed endless, stretching towards a lonely horizon. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping his suitcase tighter. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "You'll see," Alexander replied cryptically, a faint smile playing on his lips. Robert's mind raced with possibilities. Could this road lead to some secluded nursing home, far removed from the city? Was this their way of abandoning him out of sight and out of mind? Finally, the car slowed down, crunching on gravel as it pulled into a clearing. Alexander turned off the engine and turned to face Robert, his expression unreadable. "We're here, Dad." Robert hesitated, his limbs stiffening. Alexander stepped out and opened the back door. He helped Robert out of the car, gently guiding him as Marianne retrieved the suitcase. Robert adjusted his glasses, his heart pounding in his chest. He squinted in the sunlight, half expecting to see the dreary gray facade of a nursing home. Instead, his breath hitched. Before him stood a house that he recognized all too well. His house, but it wasn't the charred frame he had last seen. It had been completely restored, gleaming as if it had been plucked from his memory and brought back to life. The white paint shimmered in the sunlight, the porch railing sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled with a clarity that felt surreal. Robert's knees buckled, and Alexander quickly steadied him. "Careful, Dad," he said softly. What is this?" Robert stammered, his voice yedva above a whisper. Alexander smiled, his eyes glistening. "Welcome home, Dad." As Robert stood before the gleaming facade of his rebuilt home, his legs trembled and he gripped Alexander's arm for support. It wasn't just the house. It was the life it represented. A life that he thought had turned to ashes with the wooden beams. He blinked repeatedly, trying to convince himself that this wasn't a dream. "Come on in, Dad," Alexander said gently, guiding him towards the porch. Marion followed behind, carrying his suitcase. Robert hesitated for a moment, his fingers tracing the smooth, freshly painted railing. The scent of pine and varnish filled the air. Each step up the porch felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had been resurrected. The front door scrapale open, revealing the interior. Robert's jaw dropped. The layout was familiar, but everything felt brand new. The polished hardwood floors, the walls painted in soft, warm hues, and the furniture evoked the cozy charm that he and Sophie had once created together. On the mantelpiece, a single framed photograph caught his attention. A photo of him and Sophie on their wedding day, their smiles frozen in time. "Sophie?" Robert's voice cracked as he turned to Alexander, gestured for him to sit in his old kresla, which had been restored and reupholstered with the fabric Sophie had chosen. "Dad, we never intended to send you to a nursing home," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this house meant to you, so when it burned down, we made it our mission to rebuild it. We couldn't tell you because we wanted it to be a surprise." Marion chimed in, her hand resting on Robert's shoulder. "We used the land you loved as the foundation for something new. The neighbors helped too. Everyone wanted to contribute." Alexander reached into a drawer and pulled out an old envelope. "Do you remember the papers you signed a few months ago?" Robert nodded, his brow furrowed. "You said they were for selling the land." Alexander shook his head, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "No, Dad, those were the building permits. We needed your approval to start the reconstruction. Every nail, every beam. It's all for you." Robert's eyes welled up, his breath catching in his throat. "I thought I had lost everything. Sophie, this house, everything." Alexander handed him a thick photo album, its edges slightly burned but otherwise intact. "Not everything, Dad. Take a look." Robert's hands trembled as he opened the album. Inside were photos that had survived the fire. Photos of him and Sophie dancing on their anniversary, Alexander as a toddler taking his first steps, and Sophie tending to her garden. The pages carried a faint smell of smoke, but the images were vivid, full of life. Robert caressed a photo of Sophie holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables, her smile radiant. "She loved that garden," he murmured, tears falling onto the page. Just when he thought his heart couldn't take any more, a familiar sound reached his ears. A soft neighing echoed from outside, pulling Robert out of his reverie. He froze, his eyes widening. "Is that?" Alexander grinned and gestured towards the door. "Go see, Dad." Robert shuffled out onto the porch, his heart pounding. There, tied to a newly built post near the garden, was Palomo, his beloved horse. The old gelding's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his mane freshly brushed. Robert gasped as Buddy neighed again and stamped his hoof on the ground as if to call out to him. "Palomo!" Robert exclaimed, tears now flowing freely. He hurried down the steps as quickly as he could. The horse turned his head, recognizing his old master instantly. Robert wrapped his arms around Palomo's neck, burying his face in the animal's mane. "You're alive! I thought I had lost you too." Marianne and Alexander stood on the porch, watching the emotional reunion. "We found him a few weeks after the fire," she explained. He had wandered to the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped take care of him until we could bring him back. Robert stood there for a long moment, his hand gently stroking Palomo's mane. The warmth from the horse's body, the solid feel of the house behind him, and the presence of his family filled him with a deep, unshakable peace. He turned to Alexander, his voice choked with gratitude. "You did all this for me?" Robert asked, his voice trembling. Alexander nodded. "You've done so much for me, for us. This is just a small way to show you how much we love you." Robert shook his head, overwhelmed. "This isn't small, son. This is everything." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Robert sat on the porch with Alexander and Marianne. Buddy grazed peacefully in the yard, and the sound of distant crickets filled the air. Robert clutched the photo album to his chest, a smile gracing his lips. For the first time in years, he felt whole. His heart, once heavy with loss and loneliness, was now overflowing with joy. The home he thought he had lost forever had been returned to him, not just in bricks and wood but in love, effort, and family. "I was wrong," Robert said softly, breaking the silence. "I thought I was a burden, but you've shown me that I'm anything but." Alexander reached out and took his father's hand. "You're not a burden, you're our foundation." Robert looked at his son, then at the house, then at Buddy grazing. Peacefully, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Overcome with gratitude, Robert hugged Alexander tightly. "I'm sorry, son," he said. "I doubted you and thought you didn't care." Alexander shook his head. "You were never a burden, Dad. We just wanted to give you back the home you love. You deserve it." That evening, Robert settled into his rebuilt home, his heart brimming with a joy he hadn't felt in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the newly rebuilt house, Robert found himself standing in the living room, his eyes wandering from corner to corner. Every detail, every plank, every picture on the wall spoke of a son's unwavering love, dedication, and commitment to his father. Alexander stood beside him, a gentle smile gracing his face. Marianne had excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving the two men alone in a space that held decades of memories. Robert's throat tightened. He turned to Alexander, his voice trembling. "Son, I don't know what to say. I doubted you, I thought you didn't care, that you wanted to get rid of me." Alexander's eyes softened, and he stepped forward, placing a firm but gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, you were never a burden, never. Everything we did, all the late nights, all the weekends spent rebuilding this house, it was all because we love you, because you deserve to be happy." The sincerity in Alexander's voice was like a balm to Robert's wounded spirit. Overcome with emotion, Robert pulled his son into a tight embrace. He held on as if letting go would make it all disappear, as if this hug could convey the gratitude he couldn't express in words. "I'm sorry, son," Robert whispered, his voice muffled against Alexander's shoulder. "I let my fear and loneliness blind me. I should have trusted you." Alexander pulled back slightly to look into his father's eyes. "You've done so much for me, Dad. You raised me, loved me, and gave me a life I wouldn't have had without you. This is the least I could do for you." The moment stretched out, heavy with unspoken words. Alexander gestured towards the old Graceland near the fireplace. The very Graceland where Robert had spent countless evenings reading or simply gazing at the stars through the window. "Have a seat, Dad. There's one more thing." Robert sat down, his fingers tracing the armrests. The Graceland had been reupholstered, but it still offered the same comfort, the same familiarity. Alexander knelt beside him and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather-bound book. "This," Alexander began, handing it to Robert. "This is the diary Sophie kept. I found it while sorting through some of the things we salvaged from the fire." Robert's hands trembled as he opened the diary. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Sophie's neat handwriting. As he read, her words seemed to leap off the page, embracing him like a warm hug. She wrote about their life together, her love for him, and their dreams for their family. She wanted this house to always feel like home. Alexander said softly, "I thought you should have so her voice could always be with you. Robert's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. Thank you, he choked out. This means the world to me. Later that evening, after dinner, Robert began to unpack his belongings. Alexander and Marianne had left him to his own devices, promising to return the following day with supplies to help him restart his garden. As Robert opened his suitcase, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He took out his old photo frames, placing them carefully on the mantelpiece. A photo of Sophie smiling in their garden took center stage, her presence anchoring the room. Next, he arranged small keepsakes, a carved wooden bird that Sophie had once given him, a brass key from their original house, and a watch that had been in the family for decades. Each item carried a story, a memory that now intertwined with this new chapter in his life. As Robert continued to unpack, he found a small box at the bottom of his suitcase. Inside was an envelope addressed to Alexander. It was a letter he had written a few weeks prior, during one of his loneliest nights in Austin. In the letter, he apologized for being a burden and asked for Alexander's forgiveness for the trouble he had caused. Robert held the letter in his hands for a long moment before tearing it into pieces. No more doubts, he murmured softly to himself. Alexander has shown me that love doesn't calculate burdens. It only counts blessings. Before going to bed, Robert stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. Buddy was grazing nearby, lifting his head as Robert approached. He stroked the horse's mane, talking to him as if they had never been apart. "We're home, Palomo," Robert said with a smile, "and it's even better than I ever imagined." The stars twinkled above, their light reflecting in the gleaming windows of the house. For the first time in years, Robert felt truly at peace. He had thought he had lost everything: his wife, his home, his sense of purpose. But tonight he realized he had gained something even greater: the knowledge that he was deeply and unconditionally loved. As he stepped back inside and closed the door behind him, he paused for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of belonging. The weekends became a time of joy as Alexander and Marianne visited often. Robert tended to his garden and cared for Palomo, rediscovering a piece of himself that he thought he had lost forever. While some elderly parents are abandoned or sent to nursing homes, love and understanding can create miracles. Alexander may not have been Robert's biological son, but the bond they shared was unbreakable, a testament to the power of family. This story is a testament to love, gratitude, and the miracles that family can bring. If you were Roberto, how would you feel after realizing that you were never a burden, but always unconditionally loved? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire and bring hope to many. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of family affection, filial piety, and cherishing loved ones. Thank you for following and supporting. Let's spread good values together, because a small action can change someone's life. Wishing you always full of love and happiness. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the help of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.